So I was asked to talk about where are the patients, and is the patient himself the best target for us to really pitch a case for the left atrial appendage occlusion. So these are my disclosures. So the points to ponder would be, who sends the patients for left atrial appendage occlusion? Is the data really strong enough for universal adaptation to go out and say, everyone that has AFib and an appendage really needs a closure device? Or can a patient really subscribe to an LAA occlusion directly from an implanter? I mean, bypassing the PCP, cardiologist, the neurologist, or the gastroenterologist, whoever else is involved in their care. And does the world really have the resources to scale up this particular proposition to embark on this massive global LAA occlusion project, like Trump building the wall in the United States? So should patients approach a proceduralist directly for a LAO? So this is a two-way question, yes, no. Please vote on this. Wow, okay. It's a 50-50% split. So maybe let's see how it changes after my talk. I don't think it's going to change that much. And so why, who, when, I think are the fundamental principles that really define the progress of this field going forwards. I mean, we had a lot of data that's being generated on stroke prevention, then bleeding-related complication issues. I think we need more focus on that. And then the question of how does the whole left atrial appendage occlusion fit in the neurological conditions like Parkinson's or other neurodegenerative diseases, and patients who have impaired mobility and instability. Shall advanced age by itself be an indication for this? Or what kind of a CHATS-2 or a CHATS-VAS score do we really target? I think the question of who does these kind of procedures, electrophysiologists, interventionists, cardiothoracic surgeons, I think it's a moot point now, because the ultimate goal is for the appendage to be occluded. Whether it goes through one of these three channels, it doesn't really matter. Then what's the role of a primary prevention, as Dr. Bernie Moyer pointed out, and what's the secondary prevention and tertiary prevention aspects of how to really embrace the left atrial appendage occlusion, I think all become relevant. So then the question is the data sufficient to drive universal adaptation? Right? So we know that this works reasonably well in patients who are at high risk for bleeding and stroke. Even that, the stroke neurologists debate that the data is still not enough to really make a strong case for it, and that's the reason why we have the trepidation in its adaptation, even by most of the apex organizations around the world, where we only have a class 2B indication. And then do patients who have prior stroke related to atrial fibrillation, can you use that as an adjunct therapy, as our neurology colleague pointed out? Can you occlude an appendage and still continue them on oral anticoagulation if somebody did not have a contraindication for oral anticoagulation? Somebody who had a stroke that was obviously related to atrial fibrillation, we know that these patients are at extremely high risk for recurrent stroke, sometimes even despite adequate anticoagulation, as somebody pointed out about the concept of malignant left atrial appendage. Or can we expand this to all the patients who don't want to be on oral anticoagulation? Does the patient's choice really become an important piece here that we need to take into consideration? Or the bottom line, anybody that has an LAA, because LAA leads to AFib and stroke, and thereby we have to close it off whenever you get an appendage, as the general surgeons did years ago, ligating off the colonic appendage every single time they were in the patient's abdomen. So what would be some of the barriers to the adaptation? I think the strength of the data, even for core indication, is still trepidous. I mean, we have been in this field for 10 years, and I think we really need to generate more and more robust data. So trials like the Amulet ID would go a long way in making this case stronger for a better adaptation. I think exploring adjuvant indications is very important. I think we've been so focused on the left atrial appendage and the stroke, on the stroke component alone, that we have to pay more attention to the role of the left atrial appendage as a source of atrial fibrillation, the role of the left atrial appendage in the renin-angiotensin activation system modulation, that I'm going to show some of the data now. And how does this really translate from clinical trials into clinical adaptation? I think one of the big questions that a colleague of mine, general cardiology colleague of mine, pointed was, well, clinical trials are great, but when you really roll it out into real practice, the rate of complications go up. So how do we really change that perception and make it better, make it safer? And again, scalability, do we have the field expertise? And cost effectiveness data, as Thorsten pointed out, is it cost effective for organizations, or is it cost effective from a governmental standpoint, or cost effective from a payer standpoint? So there's a good amount of data that's being generated and being looked at, which I think is really going to impact the future of this. So this is an example of where we did adjuvant appendage ligation using a LAA device. This is what was called the LAA AF registry, where we clearly showed not only the volume reduction aspect of it, and elimination of the triggers and reentrant circuit that come from the left atrial appendage, that can really result in a significant improvement in the overall success rates of persistent atrial fibrillation cases. Using the same concept as Thorsten laid out, you do a pulmonary vein isolation, you isolate the appendage in those persistent cases, and then you close it off by using an endocardial occlusion device. Seems to be a pretty attractive way of moving the field forwards and accomplishing the long-term results that we want. And coming to the neuromodulation aspect of that, I think this is a point that is grossly underlooked. We haven't been paying closer attention to this. Left atrial appendage, being one of those primordial structures during development, has very critical connections with the autonomic nervous system as well as the adrenal systems, as a result of which the pan effects of the left atrial appendage are a lot wider than being a culprit for stroke alone. And we explored that aspect of that, and ligation of the left atrial appendage could potentially result in a significant downregulation of the renin-angiotensin activation system that could result in a very dramatic improvement in overall blood pressures. This phenomenon actually is very well observed even with atrial cases. So anytime you have a complete elimination of the left atrial appendage epicardially, you get this kind of result. This is something worthwhile exploring further. And perhaps the degree of reduction in the blood pressure is actually far better than any renal denervation study that ever existed. So can we pitch a case for a standalone left atrial appendage exclusion in patients who have recalcitrant hypertension with atrial fibrillation? Can this be the new frontier for hypertension therapy? Perhaps there is some value to exploring that aspect of that. So the AMAZE trial, which is a clinical trial that looks at a adjuvant use of appendage exclusion along with pulmonary vein isolation and caveotracheal ablation, I think is going to redefine the way we're going to take care of patients with persistent atrial fibrillation. And that is an expanded indication of how to involve appendage exclusion into and position it in a better way. So there are a lot of clinical trials that are coming out. Some are trying to establish the value of these devices for stroke prevention, as well as proving a point that they are better than anticoagulants in terms of bleeding-related complications. There are at least 3 of those studies. And then there are some that are trying to reestablish the concept of, yes, appendage exclusion actually is very valuable and it can be done standalone without using oral anticoagulation in high-risk patients that are high risk for bleeding. ASAP-2 actually answers that particular question. So the question of trials to clinical adaptation, the increase in complication rates. This is our study that looked at the MAUD database, the FDA's MAUD database we dug through. The left side is the LARIAT adaptation, the right side is the Watchman adaptation. You see an interesting trend here. So LARIAT came out into the market with a 510(k) approval where they launched the product commercially, and then they started doing clinical trials of a smaller scale. As a result of which you saw early on when the adaptation hit the peak, their complications also went to the maximum. And later on, users dwindled a little bit, as well as the ability to embrace this device, work with it has significantly improved, with improved pericardial access techniques, with improved Colchicine adaptation and all of that, as a result of which your complication rates came down significantly. With the Watchman, it was in an incubator phase in a sense that it was limited to few expert centers up until 2014, and when it got released in 2015 and people started using this device, you see a sudden spike in complications. That is reflective of pretty much most of the technologies that we have in place. And then as you see, as the operator experience improves, those complication rates continue to trend downwards. So how do we really avoid or eliminate this particular spike in technology adaptation, I think, is an important point that we all have to figure out when we really translate these materials from clinical trials into clinical practice. And perhaps the results published by Vivek and group are this is, I think, a sort of a focused look of their data that from Boston Scientific. It looks reasonable, but at the same time, there is room for improvement to change that. So where are the patients? Are we really focusing on the primary care physicians? Should we focus on our general colleagues? So we actually did an informal survey in our institution. So we asked every patient that had atrial fibrillation that came in and asked them a question: have you ever heard of left atrial appendage exclusion or occlusion? You would be surprised to hear that the number of people who know about the left atrial appendage at all in the first place, even though they had atrial fibrillation for tens of years, it was 0.4% response, which is incredible, right? I mean, that essentially tells you the ignorance levels or the patient education levels is very poor. And there is never really a discussion about why people take oral anticoagulation. These are some fundamental questions that the patient should have basic education about. So that really goes to tell you that there is room for education at every level of referral path that we deal with, right? I think we're not doing a good job with primary care physicians in talking to them about stroke, about the options that are available. Even our own general cardiology colleagues, most of the times, don't even care about talking about this, and leave alone the gastroenterologists and the neurologists who are much farther away from the whole concept than the cardiology colleagues are. So I would say, I mean, I get a fair number of referrals from urology colleagues. I get a fair number of referrals from hematologists who deal with bleeding complications and bleeding disorders and patients who have atrial fibrillation. So these are all the patient groups I think could potentially we need to work with. And then this whole concept of indication creep. I think this is something everybody worries about. I think every regulatory body and every payer in the world worries about the indication creep. So I think we should be very careful about that. So then finally, the concept of direct patient campaign, right? Using television, social media, and all of this really encouraging people to learn more about it. So is it really worthwhile? Right? Do we end up being in this situation where we become another pharmaceutical pusher where you directly market to the patient and the patient really bugs the hell out of your life until they get a device? Is that the right way of doing it, right? So better education of the primary care physicians, or maybe even data mining of electronic medical records. I think if you really looked at our own system, how many patients that have atrial fibrillation actually had appropriate education, and what kind of materials are we providing them? And how many of them are on appropriate anticoagulation, appropriate level of adherence, and which groups of these patients could be potential candidates for left atrial appendage? I think that's worthwhile effort to start from within. And how do we really influence the guidelines update? I think that is directly proportional to the amount of data that we are generating that actually can support this whole concept. And then how do you really standardize care recommendations at an institutional level as well as at an organization level, at a societal level, is going to be something that's more important. So do we really need a doctor here? Can the patient directly go to a proceduralist and get their left atrial appendage occluded? So I think FDA did a very reasonable thing by really making this into a team effort or patient-centered, patient-involved, shared informed decision making. I think is an important piece to this whole process that should not be overlooked, and I think that's the way it needs to be done. So perhaps one of these days we move from class 2B to a class 1 indication with more positive data that is about to come, and then we probably may have a lot better devices with improvements that need to happen where the procedure becomes simpler, shorter, safer, and we get the best bang for our buck. So I do believe communicating with the patient is very important. Using every opportunity and every referral path that we have in an effective fashion is going to be key for the success of the appendage closure programs. Thank you very much.